Steph Curry was relaxing at home when the phone rang. It was Seth, his younger brother, but something was completely different in his voice. Choked words, hesitant, loaded with a pain that Steph had never heard before. And then, before he could understand what was happening, Seth said something that would forever change the way the two brothers saw each other. And the line went silent. The Tuesday afternoon in San Francisco was calmer than usual at the Curry house. Steph was leaning back on the Italian leather sofa in the living room, tablet in his hands, reviewing plays from the last game against the Lakers. The low sound from the 75-inch TV mixed with the crystalline laughter of Riley and Ryan playing in the impeccably maintained backyard. Isha was in the gourmet kitchen preparing dinner, and the familiar aroma of garlic sautéed with fresh herbs hung in the air, creating that sense of home that Steph so valued. The two-story house in Atherton reflected the Curry family's success, but without excess. Tastefully decorated, it combined modern elegance with personal touches. Family photos scattered across the shelves, the girls' drawings attached to the refrigerator with personalized magnets, Steph's trophies discreetly positioned in an upstairs office. It was one of those rare moments of absolute peace in the Golden State Warriors star's life. Between exhausting morning practices, games that lasted until late, endless commercial commitments, and trips that took him across the country, Steph treasured each second of these domestic intervals like small treasures. He paused the video on a specific play, an assist that almost worked, but which he knew could have been executed completely differently if he had read the opposing defense better. "Daddy, come see what I built. It's a giant castle," Riley shouted from the back window, her voice full of the excitement of a 9-year-old who had just created something extraordinary. "Coming, princess," Steph responded, automatically smiling while saving his tactical notes on the tablet. 2 minutes. It was exactly in this moment of domestic tranquility that the phone vibrated on the sofa beside him. The name Seth appeared on the screen in white letters against a blue background. Steph frowned slightly. It wasn't common for his younger brother to call during the week, especially at a random time like that. Seth had always been more reserved with phone calls, preferring quick text messages or direct conversations after games, when they met in visiting locker rooms. In recent months, actually, communications between them had become even more sparse, not due to problems, simply because of the rush of adult life and intense professional careers. "What's up, bro?" Steph answered with his usual relaxed tone, expecting to hear Seth's characteristically calm voice asking about some technical detail or making plans to meet the next time the Warriors played in Charlotte. From the other side of the line, a deep and uncomfortable silence. Not the comfortable silence between brothers who had known each other for decades, but something heavy, loaded with a palpable tension that made Steph straighten his posture on the sofa. "Seth, are you there? Everything okay over there, man?" Finally, after long seconds that seemed eternal, Seth's voice emerged from the phone, but Steph almost didn't recognize it. It was choked, hesitant, fragmented, as if each word cost an immense effort to be pronounced. It was the voice of someone who had cried recently, or who was fighting not to cry at that exact moment. "I don't know who I am outside of all this anymore, bro." The words fell like heavy stones in Steph's stomach. He instantly got up from the sofa, the tablet forgotten among the cushions, his heart accelerating in a way that normally only happened in the final minutes of an important game. "Seth, what do you mean by that? What's happening? Are you—" But the line was already silent. Seth had hung up abruptly, leaving only the sound of the busy signal echoing in Steph's ear. Steph stood in the middle of the living room for long seconds, looking at the phone as if it could provide some additional explanation for what had just happened. His younger brother had always been the introvert of the Curry family. Since the early years of childhood, while Steph was naturally extroverted, talkative, and expressive, Seth observed the world around him, absorbed information, silently, kept his thoughts and feelings to himself, as if they were precious secrets. But never, in his entire life, had Steph heard Seth sound so lost, so desperate. Childhood memories began to surface in quick and vivid flashes. Seth, at 8 years old, sitting in the bleachers of a school gymnasium, watching Steph receive effusive praise from the youth coach after a particularly good game, and just shaking his head silently when some adult asked if he also wanted to try that complicated move that his older brother had executed. Seth, at 12 years old, training alone in the backyard until after nightfall, shooting balls at the basket illuminated only by the streetlight, never asking for help, never complaining about the lack of attention. Seth, at 15, being cut from the school team on a rainy October afternoon, while Steph was already being courted by important universities across the country. And even so, a few weeks later, showing up at Steph's games to applaud every basket by his older brother from the bleachers without showing even a trace of visible resentment. Steph tried to call back immediately. The phone rang 4 times before going straight to the familiar voicemail. "Hi, it's Seth. Leave a message." He tried again 2 minutes later. The same frustrating result. A text message typed quickly. "Seth, call me back, please. I'm worried. What's happening?" No response. Not even the blue check marks on WhatsApp, indicating that the message had been read. Who was on the phone? Isha appeared at the living room entrance, drying her wet hands on the floral apron she wore for cooking, a curious expression on her face. "Seth." Steph was standing now, nervously pacing back and forth across the spacious living room, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of anxiety that Isha knew well. "He called and I don't know. He was very strange. Different. Hung up in the middle of the conversation without explanation." Isha had known Steph long, enough to recognize when something truly disturbed him. And she had known Seth for years enough to know that he wasn't the type of person who would call without an important reason, especially to hang up abruptly like that. "Did you try calling back?" "Twice. He doesn't answer. Doesn't respond to messages either." Steph was already heading to the office, where he kept his laptop. "I need to go to Charlotte. Today." "Now?" "Steph, you have practice early tomorrow, and the game against Phoenix is... I can miss one practice. I can miss a game if necessary." The words came out faster and more intense than Steph intended. He stopped in the middle of the hallway, took a deep breath, trying to control his growing anxiety. "Sorry, honey. I didn't mean to sound harsh. It's just, I've never heard Seth like that in my life, Isha. Never. He seemed devastated." She approached, placing her warm hand on her husband's tense shoulder. "Then go. The girls and I will be fine here. Go take care of your brother." 2 hours later, Steph was at San Francisco International Airport, a small travel backpack on his shoulder containing only the essentials, and a last-minute ticket to Charlotte in his jeans pocket. He hadn't warned Seth that he was going. Something deep told him that his brother would try to dissuade him, maybe even deny that there was any problem. During the 5-hour flight across the country, Steph couldn't stop thinking about Seth's broken voice, about the specific words he had chosen. "I don't know who I am outside of all this." Outside of what exactly? Basketball? The NBA? Professional life? Or, and this possibility made Steph's stomach churn with anxiety, outside of the inevitable shadow that Steph's fame cast over everything and everyone around him? This last possibility was the one that bothered him most. Steph had never stopped to think consciously, deliberately, and honestly about how his growing fame and success could be affecting Seth. Of course, he knew that comparisons were inevitable. Both played the same position, had similar playing styles, shared the same famous surname in the basketball world. But Seth had always seemed to handle this reality well. He had always been professional, dedicated, visibly proud of his own path in the league. But maybe, and this realization hit Steph like a punch to the stomach, maybe Seth had never really talked about how he felt. Maybe he had learned, over the years, to keep these feelings to himself. And maybe Steph had never really asked, created safe space for these difficult conversations because he was too focused on his own vertiginous career. The plane began to descend in Charlotte when Steph finally made a clear and definitive decision. It didn't matter what he had left behind in San Francisco: practices, commitments, professional responsibilities. It didn't matter if he would miss some important game or disappoint coaches and teammates. At that specific moment, he wasn't Steph Curry, the multimillionaire NBA star, the face of advertising campaigns, the idol of millions of children around the world. He was just an older brother genuinely worried about someone he loved. And for the first time in a long time, that was exactly who he wanted and needed to be. Seth's apartment in the upscale South End neighborhood in Charlotte was exactly what Steph would expect from his younger brother. Impeccably organized, extremely minimalist, each object carefully positioned in its predetermined place. The pristine white painted walls reflected the abundant natural light that entered through the large glass windows, creating a clean, modern, and almost architectural environment. The dark wood floor contrasted elegantly with the contemporary furniture: a gray sofa with straight lines, a marble coffee table, brushed steel shelves with books perfectly aligned by height. But there was something in the excessive organization, in the almost obsessive perfection of the space, that sounded strangely clinical, as if it were more a showroom from a decoration magazine than a home where someone really lived, relaxed, occasionally made a mess. Steph rang the doorbell at 11:15 on Wednesday morning, after spending a restless night in a boutique hotel a few blocks away. He had slept at most 3 hours, mentally rehearsing dozens of different versions of what he would say when he saw Seth face to face, trying to find the right words for a conversation they never had before. When the door opened, Seth's face of genuine surprise quickly transformed into something more defensive, guarded, almost hostile. "What are you doing here?" The question came out colder and more cutting than Seth probably intended, but Steph could perceive the real discomfort behind the defensiveness. "You called yesterday," Steph responded simply, keeping his tone calm and non-confrontational, and then hung up in the middle of the conversation. "I was worried." Seth hesitated, visibly at the door for several seconds, as if he were internally debating between closing the door in his brother's face or letting him in. Finally, he reluctantly stepped aside to make room at the entrance. "You didn't need to come here. Cross the entire country. I'm fine." The words came out automatic, rehearsed, as if Seth had prepared for this response. "You didn't seem fine yesterday on the phone." The apartment smelled of freshly brewed coffee mixed with expensive cleaning products, an artificial cleaning aroma that Steph associated more with luxury hotels than homes. He observed discreetly while walking through the living room, Seth's small trophies arranged almost shyly on a side shelf, as if they were apologizing for existing, while a large and impressive television completely dominated the main wall. No visible family photos. No photos of the two brothers together. No sign of real personal life. "Do you want coffee?" Seth asked, already walking toward the American kitchen, clearly trying to fill the uncomfortable silence with activity. "Sure, thanks." The kitchen was equally impeccable. Quartz countertops without a single stain, stainless steel appliances that looked fresh from the store, an expensive Italian coffee maker that Steph suspected was rarely used for more than one person. They drank coffee in white porcelain cups in silence for several minutes. Steph waited patiently, respecting his brother's natural rhythm. Seth had always needed time to organize his internal thoughts before talking about anything remotely personal or emotional. "How are the girls?" Seth finally broke the silence, his voice a little more relaxed. "Good. Riley is completely obsessed with building things with Lego now. She spends hours creating elaborate castles, entire cities. Ryan is still in the phase of wanting to help Isha with absolutely everything in the kitchen." Seth smiled for the first time since Steph had arrived, a small but genuine smile. "She's going to be a chef like her mom. Maybe. Or a basketball player like her uncle." Seth's smile disappeared instantly, as if someone had turned off a light. Steph realized the colossal mistake at the exact moment the words left his mouth. "Sorry, I didn't mean to." "You don't need to apologize for everything, Steph." Seth placed the cup on the table with more force than necessary, the sound of porcelain against marble echoing in the silent apartment. "Not everything is about you." The silence that followed was dense, full of unspoken tensions and wounds inadvertently reopened. Steph felt as if he had stepped on a minefield without realizing it, without a map to navigate back to safe ground. The following hours passed with painful slowness. They talked about superficial and safe things: Seth's season schedule, recent changes in sponsors, new players who had joined the team, tactical analyses of different defensive systems. Steph noticed that Seth visibly came alive when talking about pure basketball. Complex strategies, elaborate plays, detailed technical analyses. His eyes shone, his posture straightened. He gestured with his hands to explain movements. But every time the conversation approached anything remotely personal or emotional, Seth closed up like an oyster, responding with monosyllables and quickly changing the subject. At the end of the afternoon, when the sun began to set through the large windows, painting the apartment with golden tones, Steph suggested they order food for dinner. Seth agreed with visible relief. Any activity that filled the silence was welcome. Soon they were sharing artisanal Italian pizza on expensive porcelain plates, a strange and almost comical combination that somehow perfectly captured Seth's contradictory personality. Refined and simple, sophisticated and accessible at the same time. It was after the second glass of red wine, a Chianti that Seth had opened with excessive ceremony, that the younger brother finally began to lower his emotional defenses. "Do you remember that time I was cut from the Davidson High team?" he asked suddenly, staring fixedly at the dark red liquid in his glass, avoiding eye contact. Steph searched his memory. "You were what, at the time? 16 years old?" 15. Seth took another deliberately slow sip. "It was exactly the same day you received that official letter from Duke showing interest in recruiting you." Steph felt he should remember this detail, but he didn't, and this gap in memory suddenly seemed significant, important. "I came home completely devastated that day," Seth continued, his voice getting lower, more vulnerable. "I had trained the entire season like crazy, dramatically improved my shots, my defense, my physical conditioning. I thought I finally had a real chance to be part of something important. And then..." He shrugged with residual sadness. Cut in the first round of selections. They didn't even give me a decent explanation. Seth, man, I'm sorry. I didn't know that. Of course you didn't know. The interruption wasn't aggressive, just tired. Because when I got home that day, the whole family was in total celebration mode because of your Duke letter. Dad was on the phone with their coach for 2 hours, discussing details. Mom was making elaborate plans to visit the campus. And I just went up to my room, and nobody even noticed I was devastated. Steph felt a physical tightness in his chest, as if someone had tied a rope around his lungs. Why didn't you ever say anything at the time? Seth finally looked directly at his brother, and Steph saw years of carefully hidden hurt in Seth's eyes. What was I going to say? Hey, family, stop celebrating Steph's incredible success because I just failed miserably. Was I going to ruin your important moment because of my personal disappointment? I couldn't do that. It wouldn't have ruined anything, bro. I would have what, exactly? Seth's voice was beginning to rise. Years of repressed frustrations beginning to leak out. Given up Duke? Refused the incredible opportunities that were appearing? Steph, you don't understand. It's not about you doing something different. It's about... He stopped abruptly, took a deep breath, organized his thoughts. It's about me never being able to be simply myself. I'm always Steph Curry's brother. In the following 2 hours, Seth emotionally broke down in a way that Steph had never witnessed in his entire life. He talked about how, no matter what he conquered or did, people always saw him first, and primarily as Curry's brother. How sports journalists invariably asked questions about Steph during his post-game interviews. How teammates sometimes made apparently innocent jokes about him living in his famous brother's shadow. How sponsors frequently asked if Steph could make appearances at events where Seth was the main guest. And how, gradually and imperceptibly, he had begun to see himself through these external eyes until he completely lost the notion of who he was beyond these inevitable comparisons. I don't hate you, Seth said, after a long period of talking almost non-stop, the words coming out heavy and exhausted. I love you deeply, man. I'm genuinely proud of everything you've accomplished. But I really hate, what your fame does to me internally. I hate that when I look in the mirror in the morning, the first thing I automatically think is, you'll never be as good as your brother. I hate that even when I have an exceptional night on the court, a part of my mind thinks, but it will never be like Steph played. Steph felt hot tears burning his eyes. Seth. And worst of all, Seth continued, his voice finally breaking completely, is that I don't even know what I really want from life anymore. I don't know if I play basketball because I genuinely love the sport, or because it's the only thing that connects me somehow to you. I don't know if my achievements are real and deserved, or if they're just crumbs that fall from the table of your fame. They sat in absolute silence for several minutes that seemed like hours. Steph looked at his brother, really looked, perhaps, for the first time in years, and saw not just Seth, the competent professional player, but Seth, the 32-year-old man who had spent his entire life carrying an invisible and crushing emotional weight. I'm sorry, Steph finally whispered, his own voice choked. I'm sorry for never having noticed, for never having asked, for being so focused on my own life that I let you carry this alone. Seth just shook his head slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. It's not your fault to have been born with incredible talent, Steph. You didn't choose to be extraordinary. But it's also not my fault to feel small and insignificant next to this greatness. That night, Steph slept on the comfortable sofa bed in Seth's living room. Before turning off the lights, he lay looking at the high ceiling of the apartment and realized that, for the first time in many years, he wasn't thinking about basketball, statistics, upcoming games, or tactical strategies. He was thinking about how he had been completely blind for so long to the deep pain of someone he loved more than anything in the world. On Saturday morning, Seth woke up before Steph and silently headed to the kitchen, where he prepared scrambled eggs with bacon and toast, exactly the recipe their mother, Sonia, used to make on lazy weekend mornings in childhood Charlotte. The familiar aroma of butter melting in the pan and strong coffee spread through the apartment, creating a warmer and more domestic atmosphere than Steph had felt since his arrival. When Steph came down from the living room, still rubbing his eyes and adjusting his wrinkled t-shirt, he found Seth more relaxed and present than he had seen since his arrival. There was something different in his posture, less defensive, less tense. "Did you sleep well?" Seth asked, serving steaming coffee in 2 large mugs, without the formal ritual of porcelain cups from the day before. "Better than I expected, considering everything." Steph sat at the kitchen table, a rustic wood piece that interestingly contrasted with the rest of the modern decoration. "And you?" "Me too." Seth hesitated for a moment before continuing, as if he were testing the words before pronouncing them. "Thank you for staying. I know you must have 1,000 more important things to do on a weekend." "I don't." Steph took a piece of perfectly crispy bacon. "Actually, I can't even remember the last time I had a completely free weekend for real. Without commitments, without agenda, without anyone needing me for anything." There was a new honesty in this admission that didn't go unnoticed by Seth. After the relaxed breakfast, Seth suggested something that genuinely surprised Steph. "Want to take a walk around the city? There are some places I'd like to show you, places that have become important to me." They took Seth's car, a discreet and efficient hybrid Toyota sedan, very different from the flashy sports cars that Steph was used to seeing other NBA players drive, and began an impromptu and nostalgic tour of Charlotte. The first stop was Romara Bearden Park, located in the heart of downtown. Seth parked near a small but well-maintained basketball court, with new baskets and freshly painted lines on the asphalt. "I come here at least twice a week," he said as they walked slowly through the park. "When I need to think, organize my head, or simply be in a place where I can be just a normal person." It was a typical North Carolina morning. Clear blue sky without a cloud, pleasant temperature around 75 degrees, a light and refreshing breeze moving the green leaves of the century-old trees. There were several families scattered throughout the park, children of different ages playing on the colorful playground while parents chatted animatedly on wooden benches, a group of teenagers playing frisbee in an open field, an elderly couple walking slowly, hand in hand. "Do you remember Freedom Park, there in West Charlotte?" Seth asked after a few minutes of silent walking. "Where we used to play those endless games when Dad had the summer tournaments?" Steph smiled with genuine nostalgia. "Of course I remember. You always wanted to play one-on-one, even being much smaller than me. You were 2 years older and about 6 inches taller. It definitely wasn't a fair competition. Even so, you never gave up. Even losing by 15, 20 points, you kept playing until it got completely dark." Seth laughed, a genuine and relaxed laugh that Steph hadn't heard in years. "Mom always said you were born with natural talent, and I was born with stubbornness. She said both things were equally important in basketball." They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching a large Hispanic family patiently teaching a girl of approximately 5 years old to ride a bicycle without training wheels. The father ran alongside the pink bike, firmly holding the seat, while the mother shouted enthusiastic encouragements in Spanish. The girl laughed loudly every time she managed to pedal a few meters alone. "Seth," Steph said suddenly, stopping near a decorative fountain, "can I ask you something personal?" "Sure. After last night, I think we don't have secrets anymore." "When was the first time, the very first time, that you felt you were living in my shadow?" Seth thought carefully for a long moment, looking at the children playing in the distance. "Probably in high school, but it wasn't your fault. It was when I realized that people started seeing me completely differently after you became really famous at Davidson. Before that, I was just Seth Curry, the kid who played basketball reasonably well. After that, overnight, I became Steph Curry's younger brother, that Davidson phenomenon." They sat on a wooden bench with a panoramic view of the small artificial lake in the park, where ducks swam lazily, and solitary fishermen tried their luck with their rods. "There's something I never told you," Steph said suddenly, staring fixedly at the mirrored water. "Do you remember when I was in my first difficult season with the Warriors, and we had that terrible series against the Clippers in the playoffs?" Seth remembered perfectly. Steph had played well below his standard. The Warriors had lost 4 games to 2 humiliatingly, and the sports media had been absolutely ruthless in their criticism. "I called Dad that night after the last game," Steph continued, his voice getting lower and more vulnerable. "I cried on the phone like a 10-year-old child. I said I didn't know if I was really good enough to be in the NBA, if I deserved all the attention I was getting." Seth looked at his brother with genuine surprise. Steph had never demonstrated this type of vulnerability publicly, not even within the family. "And do you know what Dad told me at that moment?" Steph turned to face Seth. He said, "Son, you need to understand something fundamental. You're not Steph Curry, the basketball player. You're Steph Curry, period. Basketball is just one of the things you do very well, but it's not who you essentially are." Steph paused, organizing his thoughts. "But I never completely understood that until last night, listening to you talk. Because as much as I try to separate things, consciously, I also get lost in that identity sometimes. I also forget who I am outside the courts, outside the spotlight." Seth remained quiet, processing this unexpected revelation. "The fundamental difference," Steph continued, "is that when I forget who I am, everyone around me constantly reminds me that I'm special, extraordinary, unique. When you forget who you are, people remind you that you're the special one's brother. And that's deeply unfair and harmful, man." They had lunch at a small barbecue restaurant that Seth frequented regularly, Midwood Smokehouse, an authentic and welcoming place where he could eat peacefully without being bothered by fans or curious people. The owners, a couple in their early 50s, treated him like a beloved regular customer, not like a celebrity. Steph observed how Seth seemed genuinely more relaxed and authentic in that environment. "Do you have a social life here in Charlotte?" Steph asked, while they shared a generous portion of smoked ribs. "I have some friends, but nothing very close or intimate." Seth shrugged naturally. "It's complicated to know if people like you for who you really are, or because you're an NBA player, or, in my case, because you're my brother." "That must be lonely sometimes." "Frequently, actually." In the afternoon, after the prolonged lunch, they went to the Spectrum Center, the stadium where Seth played his home games. The stadium was completely empty and silent, but Seth had special access and wanted to show some specific things to Steph. They walked across the professional court, and Steph carefully observed how Seth moved through the space with genuine ownership, with visible pride, with a confidence he didn't demonstrate in other environments. "Here I feel completely myself," Seth said, dribbling an imaginary ball in the center of the court. "When I'm playing, especially during games, I'm not anyone's brother. I'm just a guy who can consistently hit three-point shots and help his team win." "You're much more than that, Seth. Much more. I know that rationally." Seth stopped moving and looked directly at Steph. "I know, but sometimes it's genuinely difficult to remember, to really feel that." On the way back to the apartment, they stopped at a traffic light when Seth asked a question that caught Steph completely off guard. "Have you ever regretted being famous? Having reached where you reached?" Steph reflected carefully before responding. "I don't regret the incredible opportunities I had, the doors that opened, the people I was able to inspire. But sometimes I genuinely miss being able to be just normal. Being able to go out with Isha for dinner without being photographed by paparazzi. Being able to have a simple conversation with the girls in the park without someone listening and posting on social media. It must be strangely suffocating." "It is, yes. But I imagine for you it's strange in a completely different and maybe worse way. Having many of the disadvantages of fame, the constant comparisons, the unrealistic expectations, without necessarily having all the compensatory advantages." Seth laughed, but there was no genuine humor in the laugh. "I never thought about it exactly that way. But yes, that's basically exactly it." That night, they ordered Chinese food from a restaurant that Seth recommended and watched an old Charlotte Hornets game on TV, commenting on plays and reminiscing funny moments. During commercial breaks, they talked about everything, about their parents and how they were aging, about past and present relationships, about future plans that didn't necessarily involve basketball. "Seth," Steph said during a particularly long and reflective pause in the conversation, "I want to formally apologize to you. You've already apologized several times." "No, let me finish completely." Steph turned on the sofa to face his brother directly. "I want to deeply apologize for being an older brother so completely focused on my own life and career that I never stopped to genuinely ask how you were dealing with all this. For automatically assuming you were fine just because you always seemed strong and controlled. For never creating a safe and open space for you to talk about what you were really feeling." Seth felt his eyes beginning to well up again. "I also want to specifically apologize for all the times people compared you to me unfairly, and I said nothing to defend you or redirect them. For all the times I could have used my influence and platform to ensure you received the individual recognition you deserve, and simply didn't, because I didn't realize it was necessary." Seth's tears began to fall freely, but this time they weren't tears of sadness, frustration, or resentment. They were tears of deep and liberating relief. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked. "Thank you for finally seeing me, for really listening to me." They hugged, a long, tight embrace, full of decades of unspoken words and carefully repressed feelings. When they separated, Seth wiped his eyes and smiled in a way that Steph hadn't seen in years. "For the first time in a very, very long time," Seth said, "I genuinely feel like your brother. Not like your shadow or your reflection. Your brother. You've always been my brother, Seth. Always. I know that in my head, but now I can finally feel it in my heart." The main auditorium of the Georgia World Congress Center in Atlanta was completely packed for the NBA Foundation's annual event, specifically focused on mental health and well-being of professional athletes. More than 300 people, including active players, former athletes, experienced coaches, renowned sports psychologists, specialized media representatives, and team executives, occupied their upholstered chairs, anxiously waiting for the main panel titled "Identity Beyond the Courts: Redefining Success in Professional Sports." Backstage at the Youve event, Seth Curry carefully adjusted the microphone attached to the lapel of his impeccably tailored navy blazer. He looked visibly different from recent months. There was a more solid presence in his posture, genuine confidence in his movements, a natural lightness in his facial expression that simply didn't exist before. It was as if an invisible but crushingly heavy weight had been completely removed from his shoulders, allowing him to finally straighten up completely. "Nervous?" asked Jennifer Martinez, the event's main coordinator, an intelligent woman in her early 40s with a genuinely encouraging smile and several years of experience organizing high-level conferences. "A little nervous, yes," Seth admitted honestly, taking a deep breath. "But it's productive nervousness, you know? The kind that keeps you focused." On the other side of the stage, hidden behind the heavy curtains, Steph discreetly observed his brother through a small gap. He had arrived at the event, an hour earlier, without prior notice, and specifically asked the organization to watch from backstage. Seeing Seth at that moment, confident, serene, genuinely prepared to share his personal story with an important audience, made Steph's chest tighten with genuine fraternal pride. In the weeks that followed that transformative weekend in Charlotte, the two brothers had maintained regular and meaningful contact. Not just the functional messages about games and schedules they used to exchange, but real conversations about life, feelings, personal challenges. Seth had begun working with a therapist specialized in professional athletes, someone who understood the unique pressures of high-level sports. And gradually, week after week, he had begun to rebuild his identity in a healthier and more authentic way. The panel moderator, Dr. Michael Chen, a respected sports psychologist who had worked with several NBA teams, took the stage and introduced Seth respectfully and accurately. One of the NBA's most consistent and intelligent shooters, and a growing advocate for the importance of mental health in professional sports. Seth walked to the center of the stage with firm and confident steps, greeted Dr. Chen with a warm handshake, and sat in the comfortable armchair prepared specifically for him. "Seth," Dr. Chen began with a welcoming tone, "you specifically asked to talk about identity and comparison in the context of professional sports. Can you tell us why this theme became so important and personal to you?" Seth took a deep breath, looked calmly at the diverse audience, and began to speak with a clarity and vulnerability that impressed even Steph. "For a large part of my professional career, and even before it, I defined my personal worth and my sense of identity almost exclusively through comparison with other players. And when you base your self-esteem that way, you never manage to develop a solid and authentic identity, because you're constantly measuring your success only in relation to other people's success." A young player in the first row, Steph recognized him as Jalen Johnson, a promising rookie from the Atlanta Hawks, was completely concentrated, taking detailed notes on his phone and nodding his head in agreement. "The fundamental problem with constant comparison," Seth continued, gaining confidence with each word, "is that it literally steals your ability to celebrate your own legitimate achievements. You can have an exceptional night, score 25 points, distribute 8 assists, decisively help your team win an important game. But if someone had a statistically better night, somehow your real achievement completely loses value in your own eyes. Seth spent the next 20 minutes recounting specific details of his trajectory, without mentioning names or situations that could identify specific people, but being completely honest about his own internal struggles. He spoke openly about the first time he realized he was being publicly presented primarily through the lens of his family relationships, instead of his own merits, about how this perception gradually affected his self-esteem, his confidence on court, and eventually his performance as a player. "I started playing defensively," he explained to the absorbed audience. "And when I say defensively, I'm not talking about defense in basketball. I'm talking about defensively in life. With constant fear of failing, because failure would be public and amplified. Even afraid of succeeding because, even when I played well, it never seemed to be enough compared to the unrealistic expectations I felt people had." An experienced sports journalist in the third row respectfully raised her hand. "Seth, this is a really valuable perspective. How did you manage to break this destructive cycle? What was the turning point?" Seth smiled. Not the carefully rehearsed smile he used to give in post-game interviews, but a genuine, warm, and vulnerable smile. "I had an extremely difficult and necessary conversation with someone very close to me. A conversation I had consciously avoided for many years because I was afraid of seeming weak, or jealous, or ungrateful for the incredible opportunities I had in my career." Backstage, Steph felt an emotional knot forming in his throat. "And this person, someone I love deeply, helped me understand something fundamental. Having insecurities about your identity doesn't make you less strong as a person. Having occasional doubts about your worth doesn't make you less deserving of success. And needing genuine emotional support doesn't make you less capable of being professionally successful." Seth deliberately paused, looked directly at the main camera that was transmitting the event live to thousands of people. For any young athlete who is watching this, whether in person or online, I want you to understand something crucial. You are infinitely more than your statistics. You are more than your wins and losses. You are more than the inevitable comparisons that people will make about you throughout your career. And it's completely okay not to know exactly who you are outside of sports, as long as you're genuinely willing to do the emotional work necessary to find out." The entire audience applauded enthusiastically and prolongedly. Seth noticed that the young Hawks rookie was applauding with visible tears in his eyes, clearly touched by the message. Dr. Chen asked some additional questions about specific resources for mental health, about how teams could create emotionally healthier environments, and about practical advice for young athletes dealing with pressure and comparisons. Seth responded to each question with thoughtfulness and specificity, offering genuinely useful insights based on his personal experience. After Seth finished his participation in the panel and came down from the stage, he was immediately surrounded by a diverse group of young players, all wanting to talk more deeply about the themes he had addressed. Steph watched from afar, impressed, how Seth patiently interacted with each person, carefully listening to their concerns, offering personalized advice, sharing specific resources. It was only when the crowd around Seth naturally began to disperse, almost an hour later, that Steph finally approached. "Hey there, famous speaker," Steph said affectionately, lightly patting his brother's shoulder. "Making positive impact out there." Seth turned, genuinely surprised and obviously moved. "What the hell are you doing here? I didn't know you were coming. I thought I could personally watch my younger brother making history and inspiring people." They hugged warmly, and this time there was absolutely nothing hesitant, defensive, or reserved about the embrace. It was the sincere embrace of two men who knew each other completely, who accepted each other integrally, who supported each other unconditionally. "I'm very proud of," whispered in Seth's ear. "Very, very proud of what you said today, of the courage you had, of the difference you're making." "Thank you," Seth responded, stepping back to look Steph directly in the eyes. "For everything, for listening to me, for seeing me, for helping me get here." Later that night, Steph was in the quiet room of his hotel in Atlanta, thoughtfully looking at a photo he had taken of him and Seth after the event. Seth was smiling in a way that Steph hadn't seen in years. A full, confident, authentically his own smile. There was nothing forced or performative about it. Steph opened Instagram, carefully chose the photo, and posted it with a simple but meaningful caption: "My younger brother, my greatest example." Within minutes, the post had thousands of likes and hundreds of comments. But what most caught Steph's attention, and what most moved him, were the specific comments about Seth. People talking about his inspiring speech, about his courage in being vulnerable, about how he had touched and inspired their own lives. For the first time in his life, Seth was being seen, recognized, and celebrated specifically for who he really was as a person. Steph turned off his phone, smiled with deep satisfaction, and turned off the room light. Tomorrow he would return to San Francisco, to Isha and the girls, to his own career and responsibilities. But an important part of him would always remain connected to that transformative moment. The moment when two brothers finally found a healthy and sustainable way to share the light, instead of one perpetually living in the shadow of the other. And that same night, 250 miles away in Charlotte, Seth was also preparing for sleep. But for the first time in many, many years, he wasn't thinking about destructive comparisons or unmet expectations. He was thinking about the young player who had approached him at the end of the event and said with touching sincerity, "Thank you for helping me. Understand that it's completely okay to be myself without apologizing for it." And Seth had responded with total honesty and inner peace. I'm learning exactly that too, day after day. Because finally and definitively, he was.